Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. It started as a simple job ad pinned to the community board at my local diner. Help wanted, overnight gas station attendant, Hollow Oak Station, $20 per hour, serious inquiries only. It was a strange offer, good pay for mindless work in a rundown gas station outside of town. I had just finished up a grueling semester at college and needed the cash, so I called the number and found myself standing in Hollow Oak a few days later. The manager, a gruff, heavy-set man named Jackson, hired me on the spot. His interview was a grunted, "You look decent enough," followed by an almost apologetic, "This place is weird at night, though. Just follow the rules." I laughed, assuming he was talking about the usual store policies. He gave me a strange look but didn't elaborate. On my first shift, I met Ray, the night attendant I'd be replacing. He was a tall, wiry guy, probably in his mid-50s, with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and a cigarette perpetually hanging out of the corner of his mouth. His face was weathered, lined with shadows that seemed to run deeper than the bags under his eyes. He spent the first half of the shift silently training me, showing me how to check stock, monitor the pumps, and handle the ancient cash register. It was all basic stuff until he suddenly grew serious and pulled me aside. "Listen, kid," Ray said, glancing around as if making sure no one else could hear. "There are some rules you need to follow here. They might sound strange, but they're real and they're important." "Rules?" I asked, smirking. "Like don't smoke by the pumps?" Ray didn't smile. "No, these are different. These rules are for the things that come around at night." I felt a chill despite myself. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a dim, almost sickly glow that barely reached the dusty corners of the store. Ray took a deep breath, then looked me dead in the eye. "The first rule: if you see a little boy come in, about 7 or 8 years old, wearing a red jacket, do not speak to him. Don't look at him. Just pretend he's not there." "What?" I stammered, my mind reeling. Ray's face remained deadly serious. "He'll come in sometimes, wandering the aisles, looking lost. You might hear him call for help. Ignore him. No matter how real it feels, do not engage. If you talk to him, he'll latch onto you." I laughed nervously, waiting for him to tell me it was some kind of joke. But Ray's expression remained grave. "What happens if I talk to him?" I asked, half joking, half curious. Ray didn't answer. He simply muttered, "You don't want to know," before moving on to the next rule. "The second rule," he continued, his voice low, "is to stay out of the shadows. If the lights flicker or go out, don't wander into the dark corners. There's something in the shadows. You might see movement, figures in the dark. Just don't follow them, no matter how curious you are." I glanced around, noticing how the corners of the gas station seemed to be cloaked in murky darkness. I shivered, feeling a sudden urge to stay far from the edges of the store. "What kind of figures?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ray shrugged, his gaze fixed on a spot in the distance. "Things that shouldn't be there. Don't look too close. Trust me." The night dragged on, and I could feel Ray's eyes on me whenever I seemed even remotely curious about the shadows or the dark corners of the store. The old peeling walls seemed to hum with something unsettling, as if they'd absorbed years of strange occurrences that no one ever spoke about. It was nearing 2 a.m. when Ray approached me again. "The third rule," he whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear, "is about the back door." I turned to see the door in question, tucked in the far corner with a faded, "Employees Only" sign plastered on it. It looked ordinary enough, but there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Never open that door," Ray said, his voice a barely audible murmur. "It doesn't lead anywhere good. Sometimes you'll hear noises from behind it, knocking, scratching, even voices. Ignore it. Just pretend it's not there." My mouth felt dry. "What's behind it?" Ray shook his head, his expression dark. "I don't know. But the last guy who opened it, he didn't come back right. Jackson had to, well, let's just say he doesn't work here anymore." The rest of the shift was tense. Every flicker of the lights, every creak of the floorboard seemed magnified, amplified by Ray's whispered warnings. When a scratching noise came from the back door around 3 a.m., I froze, my eyes locked on the door as if it might open on its own. Ray shot me a warning glance. "Ignore it," he mouthed, his face grim. As the hours crawled by, Ray's final words to me echoed in my mind. "The light outside by the gas pumps? Keep an eye on it. If it ever goes out, you have to fix it immediately. Don't hesitate, don't waste time. If it stays dark too long, well, they'll come, and you don't want them coming." "Who are they?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Ray looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between fear and resignation. "Just keep the light on." At the end of the shift, as the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, Ray grabbed his jacket and gave me one last piece of advice before he left. "If I ever disappear during your shift," he said slowly, "don't come looking for me. Don't call out my name. Don't try to find me. Just pretend I was never here. Got it?" Before I could respond, he walked out, leaving me alone in the dimly lit gas station with his cryptic warnings and a deep sense of dread. I stood there, heart pounding, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. The night wore on, and everything remained eerily still. The kind of stillness that made you feel like you were waiting for something to happen, but not in the good way. It was the kind of quiet that felt oppressive, as if something unseen was watching, waiting for you to slip up. Ray didn't speak much. He'd finished his coffee and sat behind the counter, staring blankly at the flickering parking lot lights. The occasional car rolled in, but it was always the same. Just a quick fill-up, then they were gone. I was starting to grow restless, the silence gnawing at my nerves. As I walked past the counter to check the bathrooms, Ray cleared his throat. His voice was low, gravelly from years of smoking. "Second rule," he said without looking at me. I paused and turned back toward him. "What?" Ray glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he regarded me with a mix of weariness and concern. "If you see the lights flicker, you stay in the light. Don't venture into the shadows. The dark corners of this place, they hide things." I frowned. "What kind of things?" Ray shifted his weight, finally glancing over at me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. "Things that don't belong. I've seen them, moving in the dark. You don't want to know what they are. Just trust me. Stay in the light, and don't look too closely at the shadows. They'll come for you if you do." His words felt off, as if there was more he wasn't saying, but I didn't press him. Part of me was too nervous to ask any more questions. I'd only been working here for a couple of hours, but something about the place was starting to get to me. Maybe it was the isolation, or the fact that it felt like time was moving differently here, slower, heavier. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the growing sense that I wasn't alone, even when the store was empty. I kept my eyes on the parking lot. The old lights flickered occasionally, casting long, jagged shadows across the concrete. I couldn't help but glance toward the far corner of the station where the shadows seemed thicker, more solid. It was hard to shake the feeling that something was hiding there, waiting for me to wander too close. After a few more hours passed in silence, I found myself yawning uncontrollably. The dull hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional flicker of the parking lot lights did nothing to ease my exhaustion. It was almost 3 a.m. when Ray spoke again. "Third rule," he muttered, as if he'd been waiting for me to ask. I glanced up from the counter where I'd been zoning out. "Yeah?" "The back door." Ray's voice dropped to a near whisper. "The one that says employees only. Don't go near it. Don't even think about opening it. If you hear something from behind it, don't look. Don't listen. Just pretend you didn't hear anything. The door stays closed. Got it?" I frowned. "What's behind the door?" Ray didn't answer immediately, but I could tell he was debating whether to tell me. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice low and almost reluctant. "Don't know. Don't care to find out. Sometimes there's scratching. Sometimes there's tapping. Sometimes, voices. But nothing good comes from opening that door. Just ignore it. The door stays closed. I felt a chill run through me as I nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. Was he trying to scare me? Or was this a warning I needed to take seriously? Either way, I wasn't going to go near the door. But there was something about the way he said it that made it impossible to forget. The image of that door, faded and scratched, loomed in the back of my mind. The clock ticked on, and I found myself becoming more aware of the strange weight pressing down on me. The station felt darker than it should have been, even though the lights were on. It was like the shadows had a life of their own, stretching into corners they didn't belong. I tried to focus on my duties, checking the stock, keeping an eye on the pumps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was around 4 a.m. when the unexpected happened. The parking lot light near the pumps flickered, just once, but enough to make me jump. I stared at it, my heart racing. It had happened just like Ray had warned. I knew the rule. If the light went out, something would come. I rushed outside, heart pounding, and quickly fumbled with the switch. The light sputtered and flickered again, but it didn't go out completely. I let out a sigh of relief, but the tension didn't lift. I knew I had to stay vigilant. If the light went out for real, I didn't want to think about what would happen then. When I stepped back inside, Ray was still behind the counter, exactly where he had been before, as if nothing had happened. But I wasn't so sure anymore. The air felt heavier now, as if it were thick with the weight of something unseen. I walked past the counter, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to shake off the unease. That's when I heard it. A soft, barely audible sound, scratching. It was coming from the back, from behind the employees-only door. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my mind racing. Was it the same scratching Ray had warned me about? I tried to ignore it, to follow the rule, but it was hard. The sound was so faint, yet it felt like it was pulling me toward the door, urging me to look, to see what was behind it. I tried to convince myself it was just the old building settling, just the sound of pipes or wind. But the scratching persisted, and with it came a faint tapping, like a knuckle rapping against wood. I couldn't help myself. I found my feet moving toward the back of the station, as if the sound had taken control of my body. I reached the door before I even realized what I was doing. I stood there for a moment, hand on the doorknob, before everything in my mind screamed at me to turn around. I pulled my hand back, stumbling away from the door, heart racing. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I didn't know how much longer I could stay here. Something was wrong with this place, with Ray, with everything. Just then I heard the door chime. Someone had entered the station. I was frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat as I listened to the door chime echo through the quiet station. Someone had entered, but I couldn't see them yet. My pulse raced, and my hands felt clammy, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't afford to lose focus, not now. I glanced toward the back door again, the faint scratching still echoing in my mind. I quickly turned my attention to the front, where the faint shadow of a figure was now visible by the door. A man, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s. He was wearing a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the hood. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He hadn't come in through the front with the usual ease. There was no casual wave, no nod or small talk. He didn't seem surprised by the emptiness of the station. In fact, it almost felt like he expected it. He walked slowly toward the counter. As he did, his eyes never left mine, cold, unnervingly so. I swallowed hard and tried to smile, forcing myself to be polite. "Can I help you?" My voice sounded thin, and I immediately hated how it trembled. The man stopped just short of the counter, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak at first, just studied me with those icy eyes. My stomach churned as I tried to hold his gaze, but I could feel my own discomfort creeping in. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice a little shaky. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was considering something. Then, without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He set it on the counter between us, sliding it toward me with a deliberate, almost unsettling slowness. I hesitated for a moment before picking up the paper. My fingers brushed against the cool surface, and I could feel a slight tingle run through me. I opened the paper carefully, my heart hammering in my chest. It was a drawing. The sketch was crude but precise. A figure, barely human, with long, thin arms and a twisted, broken face. A face that seemed to shift in the paper like it was moving. The figure was standing in a dark room bathed in shadows, with long, spindly fingers reaching out toward the edges of the page. And behind the figure, in faint ink, were the words, "Don't let it in." I felt the blood drain from my face. I dropped the paper like it was a hot coal, the message burning into my mind. The man didn't speak a word. He simply stood there, watching me with those cold, unreadable eyes, as if waiting for something I couldn't comprehend. I took a step back, my breath coming faster now, trying to steady myself. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice cracking. The man's lips curled up into the faintest of smiles, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's already here," he whispered. The words chilled me to the bone. I couldn't understand what he meant, but somehow, I didn't need to. The air in the station felt wrong, suffocating. My thoughts swirled and everything seemed to blur at the edges, like reality itself was fraying. Just as I was about to ask him to leave, the door behind the counter, the one marked "Employees Only," creaked. It was faint at first, barely a sound, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I dared not look toward it, but I could feel something shift in the air. The man behind the counter, still silent, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, but he didn't care. The scratching sound returned, louder now, from the back door. It was unmistakable. I had no idea what it was, but I could feel its presence, like a creeping shadow behind me. The man raised an eyebrow at me, as if acknowledging my fear. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned and walked out of the station without another word. I stood there, completely still, listening as the door closed behind him. My breath was shallow, my mind racing, but there was no mistaking it. The scratching from the back door was now much louder, and it wasn't stopping. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't want to. The rules, Ray's warnings, the light, the shadows, the door. I was about to break the most important rule, but I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to know what was behind that door. With shaking hands, I grabbed the flashlight from beneath the counter. I took a step toward the back, but just as my fingers brushed the doorknob, I heard it. A voice, low and hollow, whispering from the shadows behind the door. "Let me in." I was frozen in place. My breath caught in my throat as I listened to the door chime echo through the quiet station. Someone had entered, but I couldn't see them yet. My pulse raced, and my hands felt clammy, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't afford to lose focus, not now. I glanced toward the back door again, the faint scratching still echoing in my mind. I quickly turned my attention to the front, where the faint shadow of a figure was now visible by the door. A man, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s. He was wearing a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the hood. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He hadn't come in through the front with the usual ease. There was no casual wave, no nod or small talk. He didn't seem surprised by the emptiness of the station. In fact, it almost felt like he expected it. He walked slowly toward the counter. As he did, his eyes never left mine. Cold, unnervingly so. I swallowed hard and tried to smile, forcing myself to be polite. "Can I help you?" My voice sounded thin, and I immediately hated how it trembled. The man stopped just short of the counter, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak at first, just studied me with those icy eyes. My stomach churned as I tried to hold his gaze, but I could feel my own discomfort creeping in. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice a little shaky. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was considering something. Then, without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He set it on the counter between us, sliding it toward me with a deliberate, almost unsettling slowness. I hesitated for a moment before picking up the paper. My fingers brushed against the cool surface and I could feel a slight tingle run through me. I opened the paper carefully, my heart hammering in my chest. It was a drawing. The sketch was crude but precise. A figure, barely human, with long, thin arms and a twisted, broken face. A face that seemed to shift in the paper, like it was moving. The figure was standing in a dark room bathed in shadows, with long, spindly fingers reaching out toward the edges of the page. And behind the figure, in faint ink, were the words, "Don't let it in." I felt the blood drain from my face. I dropped the paper like it was a hot coal, the message burning into my mind. The man didn't speak a word. He simply stood there, watching me with those cold, unreadable eyes, as if waiting for something I couldn't comprehend. I took a step back, my breath coming faster now, trying to steady myself. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice cracking. The man's lips curled up into the faintest of smiles, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's already here," he whispered. The words chilled me to the bone. I couldn't understand what he meant, but somehow I didn't need to. The air in the station felt wrong, suffocating. My thoughts swirled and everything seemed to blur at the edges like reality itself was fraying. Just as I was about to ask him to leave, the door behind the counter, the one marked "Employees Only," creaked. It was faint at first, barely a sound, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I dared not look toward it, but I could feel something shift in the air. The man behind the counter, still silent, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, but he didn't care. The scratching sound returned louder now from the back door. It was unmistakable. I had no idea what it was, but I could feel its presence, like a creeping shadow behind me. The man raised an eyebrow at me, as if acknowledging my fear. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned and walked out of the station without another word. I stood there, completely still, listening as the door closed behind him. My breath was shallow, my mind racing, but there was no mistaking it. The scratching from the back door was now much louder, and it wasn't stopping. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't want to. The rules, Ray's warnings, the light, the shadows, the door. I was about to break the most important rule, but I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to know what was behind that door. With shaking hands, I grabbed the flashlight from beneath the counter. I took a step toward the back, but just as my fingers brushed the doorknob, I heard it. A voice, low and hollow, whispering from the shadows behind the door. "Let me in." I stood frozen, my hand still gripping the doorknob, my heart racing in my chest. The voice, low, almost like it came from the depths of the earth itself, had sent a cold shiver down my spine. It wasn't the voice of a man, or anything human for that matter. It was something darker, older, like the very air around me had taken on a voice of its own. "Let me in," it whispered again, this time closer, almost as if it were breathing directly into my ear. I dropped the flashlight in a panic, the beam spinning across the floor as it rolled away from me. The station was now plunged into near total darkness, save for the dim light filtering in from outside. But even that felt wrong, like it wasn't enough to fight back the growing shadow around me. My hand trembled as I reached down to pick up the flashlight, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I didn't want to open the door. I couldn't. But every fiber of my being screamed that I had to. Whatever was behind that door, whatever it was, needed to be faced. I forced myself to turn the doorknob. It clicked loudly, too loudly, like the sound was echoing through my skull. I pulled the door open, but as soon as I did, I regretted it. The air that poured out was thick and heavy, like it carried the scent of damp earth and decay. The hallway beyond was swallowed in shadow, the faint outline of what might have been a staircase leading down into the unknown. I felt a weight settle over me, something oppressive, as if the darkness itself were watching, waiting. I took one step into the hallway. The floor creaked beneath my boots, but I couldn't stop now. Something was drawing me in. I needed to know what was back there. Maybe it was the whispering. Maybe it was the fact that everything I'd heard and seen so far had felt like a warning. But one thing was certain. I wasn't leaving without answers. I turned the flashlight on, the beam flickering at first, but then it steadied. It barely illuminated anything beyond a few feet, but that was enough to see the walls, which were lined with old, brittle-looking papers. Some of them were tacked up, others just resting against the walls as though they had been placed there by someone who knew I would come. I took a cautious step deeper into the hallway, my ears straining for any sound. The scratching had stopped, but now there was a strange hum in the air, like the building was vibrating on a frequency I couldn't understand. The further I went, the heavier the air seemed to become, pressing against me with every breath. The walls narrowed as I continued, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step. I felt cold fingers brushing against my neck, but when I turned around, nothing was there. I didn't even know why I was still going, why I hadn't just turned back and locked myself in the front of the station. I could feel the weight of Jackson's warning pressing against my thoughts, but there was no turning back now. Then, just as I was about to reach the end of the hallway, I saw it. At the very end, standing in the doorway of what looked like a small storage room, was a figure. Not the man from earlier. This one was taller, hunched, and covered in shadows. Its shape was distorted, as if it couldn't decide if it was human or something else entirely. The figure didn't move at first, but I could feel its eyes on me, those cold, empty eyes that burned into my very soul. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't move. It felt like the room itself had become a trap, and I was the prey. Then, it spoke. "Jackson never told you about the door, did he?" I tried to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The figure's voice was deeper than before, like it was coming from all around me, not just from the thing standing in front of me. "The door," it said again, "is the key. You'll never leave, not unless you understand it. Understand why the rules are here, why we're here." The air around me seemed to hum with an unbearable pressure, and the walls felt like they were closing in. I knew that if I didn't leave now, if I didn't turn around and get out of there, I'd never make it back. But before I could turn, the figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its long arms reached toward me, and in that moment, I understood. It was not a person. It wasn't even human. I scrambled backward, my legs tangling as I tried to retreat. The figure advanced, its feet dragging along the floor, leaving marks in the dust behind it. Then, just as my back hit the wall, a voice, Ray's voice, cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The whisper echoed in my ears, and in that moment I knew. I had just crossed the point of no return. The air felt like it was thickening with every passing second, suffocating me, as if the entire gas station were holding its breath. I pressed my back into the cold wall, trying to put distance between myself and the figure that loomed closer with each unnatural step. My legs trembled, my thoughts scattered, and yet something deep inside me, told me I couldn't look away, that I had to face this. The figure's distorted shape had no real form. It shifted, its limbs elongating unnaturally, bending and stretching in ways that couldn't be natural. A sound like fabric tearing echoed as it moved, a grotesque whisper escaping from its lips with every exhale. It wasn't even speaking words anymore, just a series of growls and low moans that rattled my very bones. "You shouldn't have opened the door," Ray's voice echoed again, this time more urgent. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The oppressive weight in the air held me in place like an invisible chain. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The hallway seemed to stretch, narrowing the farther I looked, the walls closing in, pushing me closer to the creature that had emerged from the darkened room. Suddenly I felt something cold brush against my arm. It was like ice itself had touched my skin, and a jolt of electricity shot through my body. My heart lurched in my chest as I twisted, frantic, to see what had happened. The hallway was empty now. The figure, the door, the room, all gone. I was standing in the same place, but everything had changed. The station was silent again, almost too silent, like the world had paused. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the clock from the front counter, but even that seemed to echo through the stillness, making the silence somehow heavier. The door. It had to be the door. The rules, Jackson's warnings. They all came back to me now. What was it that Ray had said? The door is the key. What did that mean? Why had I opened it? I reached for the flashlight, my hands shaking as I fumbled to switch it back on. The beam flickered to life, casting weak light across the hallway. Nothing had changed, but everything felt wrong. Like the air was suffocating me, like I wasn't alone. A sudden movement caught my eye. Something shifted in the darkness at the far end of the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat and I snapped my head to the side, expecting to see that horrible creature again. But all I saw were shadows. Just shadows, stretching and warping in ways that defied reality. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, and my pulse quickened. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape this nightmare. But I couldn't. Something was holding me in place. Something tied to that door, to this station. I turned my attention back to the storage room at the end of the hallway. It stood there, the doorway still ajar, inviting me in. But I knew better now. I knew I had to get out. I needed to get back to the front of the station. I needed to find Jackson, to demand answers. But as I took a step toward the exit, a new voice cut through the silence. You can't leave. It was faint at first, but the words grew louder, more forceful, until it felt like the very walls of the station were speaking to me. I froze in my tracks. You opened the door, the voice continued, and now you belong to us. The shadows in the hallway seemed to gather around me, closing in. I felt the cold breath on my neck again, but when I spun around, there was nothing there. Only the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes, watching, waiting. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care what happened to the flashlight, what happened to the station, to the rules. I just needed to escape. I needed to feel air, to feel the sun on my face again, to prove to myself that this was just a nightmare, a bad dream. But as I reached the front door, my hand on the handle, I stopped. I couldn't pull it open. The door was locked. I turned back, my heart racing, panic surging through my veins. The hallway was empty, but it was no longer quiet. It hummed with a low, persistent sound, like a deep vibration in the air that rattled my teeth. I stared at the door, willing it to open. Nothing happened. Then, I heard it. We warned you. It was Ray's voice, but it sounded different now, slower, heavier, as though he were speaking from far away. You're not leaving. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, soft at first, but growing louder. I spun around, my heart thumping in my chest, but I knew, just like I had always known, that I wouldn't escape. Not this time. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in front of the door, staring at the emptiness of the hallway. My breath was shallow, each inhalation a sharp stab in my chest, and my mind raced with thoughts I couldn't focus on. All I knew was that I had crossed some invisible line, and now there was no turning back. The footsteps grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one set of footsteps now. It was many, a cacophony of unnatural, dragging steps that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to move. The shadows in the hallway twisted, stretching like black ink seeping from a page, coiling around the edges of the walls, creeping closer to me. The air in the gas station seemed to get colder, biting through my jacket as though the very atmosphere were alive. I forced myself to take a step back, my hand still gripping the cold, unyielding handle of the door. It wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, no matter how desperately I tried, it remained sealed shut. We warned you, Ray's voice echoed again, but this time it wasn't just from the shadows. It felt like it was coming from everywhere. Inside my head, inside the walls, inside the very foundation of the gas station. I stumbled back from the door, fear flooding my body, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from the hallway. The shadows were alive now, moving like tendrils reaching toward me. And I knew they were not shadows at all. "This is your last chance." The voice came again, clearer now. "You can join us, or you can disappear." The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, as though the station itself were shifting, breaking down the barriers between this world and whatever else lay beyond. The shadows, no longer just creeping along the floor and walls, began to rise, stretching out like dark pillars, towering over me. Each one seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. Each one was alive, alive with hunger. "You should have followed the rules," Ray's voice warned again, though it was quieter this time. I couldn't see him, couldn't hear him move, but I knew he was somewhere close, somewhere within reach. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stumbled backward, my feet dragging on the cold floor. I had to think, had to find a way out. The door. Why wouldn't it open? Why wouldn't it let me escape? I turned, frantic, looking around the gas station for any other means of escape. The back office was an option, but it was locked. The windows? Shattered, covered in grime. Everything around me felt wrong, as though the entire building was suffocating under its own weight. The shadows in the hallway continued to grow, and I saw them now. Figures, human-shaped, but distorted, twisted. They moved in sync with the shadows, their forms barely visible in the flickering light, their faces covered by the darkness. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were here for me. I reached for my phone, my last lifeline, but when I looked at the screen, the display was empty. No signal, no messages, no way to call for help. The silence in the station was deafening now, the ticking clock from the counter the only sound left. And then I heard it, the sound of scraping metal. My eyes shot to the front door again. Something was moving on the other side. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, hear it. A scratching, scraping, gnawing sound. Something was trying to get in. "You're not leaving," the voice whispered again, this time so close it was as if it were right behind me. "Not without us." The shadows surged forward, enveloping me. I could feel their cold fingers reach for me, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in their grip, surrounded by their heavy presence. Suddenly, the door rattled, shaking violently as if something powerful was trying to break through. I turned and stared at the door, desperately willing it to open. It didn't. Then, with a sickening crack, something outside gave way. The door splintered at the edges, a jagged line appearing down its center. I heard the sound of something heavy pushing against the door, trying to break through. My heart was in my throat, my vision narrowing as panic set in. I had to get out. I had to get out. But there was nowhere left to go. No exits, no escape. The station was closing in on me. The shadows moved faster now, swirling around me like a whirlpool of darkness. I felt the cold air wrap around my body, pulling me toward the center of the room. A deafening crash. The front door exploded inward, and everything went black. The hours crawled by, the only sounds in the station being the occasional hum of the refrigerators, the flickering of the dim lights above, and the faint whispers of the wind outside. I tried to settle into the monotony of the job, but every time I glanced at the clock, it seemed like barely any time had passed. My mind kept circling back to Ray's cryptic warnings. By now, I had seen enough to understand that something wasn't right here. It wasn't just the strange rules or the flickering lights. There was something wrong with the entire atmosphere of the gas station, as though the air itself was thick with unspoken tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan from the walls felt like a warning, and every dark corner felt like something was watching. Around 2 a.m. the silence broke. The door chimed, and I turned instinctively, expecting a customer. But there was no car pulling up, no headlights flashing through the windows. The door had opened by itself. I stood frozen, watching the door as it slowly swung open, almost as though someone had nudged it with a ghostly hand. There was no one there. A chill ran down my spine, and my fingers twitched toward the flashlight at my belt. But then, something strange happened. From the shadows near the back of the station, I saw a figure step into the light. It was a boy, no older than 8 years old. His red jacket stood out like a bloody beacon against the dull, flickering lights of the gas station. His eyes were wide, searching as he scanned the interior of the store. The boy was alone. I couldn't help myself. I glanced at Ray, half expecting him to acknowledge the child's arrival, but he didn't react. His gaze remained fixed ahead, distant and unfocused, as though he hadn't even noticed the boy. The child took a hesitant step forward, his small feet echoing in the otherwise silent station. He stopped just inside the door, looking up at me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Mister?" The boy's voice was soft, almost fragile. "Can you help me? I'm lost. I can't find my mom." The room seemed to close in around me. Every fiber of my being screamed to help him, to walk over and offer some comfort. But Ray's warning, the first rule, echoed in my mind. Don't speak to him. Don't acknowledge him. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. I wanted to move, to reassure the child, but instead I just stood there, my gaze locked on him. The boy's face shifted slightly, an expression of confusion growing as he waited for my response. His small hands fidgeted with the zipper of his jacket, a nervous tic that somehow made him look even younger. "Mister?" he asked again, his voice trembling. "Please, I'm scared." The urge to reach out to him to comfort him nearly overwhelmed me. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I remembered Ray's exact words. "If you see a boy in a red jacket, don't talk to him. Don't acknowledge him." The boy looked up at me with his wide, pleading eyes, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. I could feel the air grow colder, the silence growing thicker around us. The boy's eyes, once so innocent, suddenly seemed off. There was something cold, hollow about them now. They flickered, like the reflection of something monstrous hiding just beneath the surface. "Why won't you help me?" His voice was louder now, no longer soft and pleading, but demanding, sharp. The words came out wrong, too old for a child, too harsh. The smile that spread across his face widened unnaturally, too wide for his small face. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find the voice. The boy's expression shifted again, morphing into something that wasn't quite human anymore. The shadows seemed to crawl closer, and I knew without a doubt that whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a lost child. He stepped closer to me, and that's when I noticed the change in his skin. It wasn't right. His skin looked too pale, too smooth, like a mask stretched too tight. "Please help me," he repeated, but his voice was different now, deeper, older. It didn't sound like a child anymore. It was a mockery, an echo of something else. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The boy, or whatever he was, didn't move closer, but his presence grew oppressive, suffocating. It felt like the entire station was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The flickering lights above buzzed erratically, casting sharp shadows across the floor. I glanced at the back of the station, where the employees-only door loomed dark and ominous. The door groaned as if something on the other side was pushing against it. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the boy in the red jacket. "Why won't you help me?" His voice was now a guttural rasp, like something inhuman was trying to claw its way out of him. I turned away. I couldn't look at him anymore. I couldn't acknowledge what I knew wasn't real. The air seemed to freeze around me, and I felt my heart stop as the door chimed once again. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was coming next, but I couldn't resist. A heavy, unnatural weight pressed down on me and I turned slowly. The boy was gone. The door had closed behind him with a soft click, and the station was silent once more. But the atmosphere had shifted. The stillness felt wrong, heavy with something I couldn't name. Ray didn't move. He hadn't reacted to the boy's presence at all. It was as though nothing had happened. His gaze remained fixed on the dim lights outside, distant, as though nothing could touch him anymore. My legs felt weak as I moved back behind the counter. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Was it really gone? Was it all just some strange, shared hallucination? I glanced up at Ray, but there was no sign of recognition in his eyes. His coffee sat untouched in front of him, cold and dark. The only thing that seemed real now was the darkness creeping in from the edges of the room, whispering softly. But I couldn't afford to get lost in my thoughts. Not now. Something was coming, and I had to be ready. The tension in the gas station had never felt more palpable. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second a weight pressing down on my chest. I knew something was about to happen, something worse than the strange events I had already witnessed. Ray had been more distant than ever, his gaze unwavering, as though he could sense the dark energy seeping into the very walls of the station. Every few minutes the door would jingle with the softest sound, though no customers entered. There were no cars pulling up. The night had become a dark void, and we were the only souls in it. Suddenly the lights flickered again. This time they buzzed loudly before going completely out. The cold, sterile glow vanished, replaced by a suffocating blackness. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight at my belt. When I clicked it on, the beam was weak, flickering in the oppressive darkness, and I could barely see anything beyond the glow of the flashlight. But I could feel something there, something watching me from the edges. I turned to Ray, but he hadn't moved. His stare was fixed on the dark corner near the back door, as if he were waiting for something to emerge. I wanted to scream, to shout at him, but I couldn't. My voice had been stolen by the fear that gripped me, tight and unrelenting. Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They were coming from the hallway that led to the storage room. I could hear the soft shuffle of shoes against the linoleum, accompanied by the unmistakable raspy sound of breathing. A low, haggard breath that made my skin crawl. It was coming closer. I pointed my flashlight down the hall, and for a brief moment, I saw it. The shape. It was a figure, shrouded in shadow, its movements jerky and unnatural, like something caught between worlds. I couldn't see its face, but the energy it exuded was suffocating, like it was trying to pull me into the darkness with it. Before I could react, the door to the back storage room slammed open with a deafening bang. The footsteps stopped. The air became thick with the smell of stale smoke, like something ancient and decayed. Ray didn't even flinch. He didn't move. A voice, a deep guttural rasp, came from the darkness behind the door. It was not a voice that should have come from a living being. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the words trembling with some malevolent force. And in that instant, I knew. I knew what this place was. This wasn't a normal gas station. It was a place that existed on the edges of the world, a place where rules didn't apply and the darkness had teeth. It was a place that had drawn me in, had lured me into its grasp with promises of normalcy, until the moment when it showed its true face. I looked back at Ray. He was still staring at the dark corner, unmoving. His expression hadn't changed, but there was something hollow about him, something lifeless. I realized then that Ray wasn't just the manager of Hollow Oak. He was a part of it, a part of whatever cursed thing lingered here, a sentinel for something ancient, something beyond understanding. And as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, I understood one final terrible truth. There was no escaping Hollow Oak.